This video is brought to you by BattleAxe. In this 3-part tutorial, I'm going to go in depth and recreate the Cobra Kai end title graphic. I'm providing all the stock elements we'll need as well as the final After Effects project file because this project is completely procedural and you can apply it to absolutely any graphic you want, for better or worse. In part 1, we'll learn how to create a distressed metal object with animated reflections. Part 2 will cover lighting that object and placing it on a grungy background with realistic shadows. And in Part 3, we'll use CC Particle World to generate an atmosphere of ash and glowing embers and put the finishing touches on the entire composition. Let's get started. The first thing I needed was the Cobra Kai logo, and I ended up just tracing this by hand in Illustrator, which took about an hour to do because it is a kind of complex logo. But now that that's out of the way, I can transfer it over to After Effects using my favorite method, which is Overlord from BattleAxe. All I have to do is click the push button and it's going to rebuild that entire logo in After Effects as a shape layer, exactly how I had it in Illustrator. It's the quickest way to get Illustrator artwork into After Effects. If you're not using it already, click the card above to learn more about Overlord. Believe me, you will never know how you ever lived without it once you start using it. Now that I have this in After Effects, I'm gonna rename this Cobra Kai logo, and I'm gonna go ahead and pre-compose it right away. And the reason I'm pre-composing it, I'll call this logo source, is because anything that I put into this pre-comp is going to have this entire style applied to it. So the lighting, the shadow, the reflections, everything will be updated based on whatever's inside of this comp, which makes this a really procedural and powerful project. Now, if you want to follow along with me, you can download all the assets for this tutorial. Just follow the link in the description. And if you don't have time to rebuild the entire project, the actual project file is going to be included as well. So go check the description for that link. And I have put the original animation here in my comp for reference, and I want to point out something about this. Notice how dim and moody the lighting is. Everything is really, really dark. Even the brightest parts of this logo are not that bright. There's a super strong vignette, very moody lighting, and it gives a very cool vibe that obviously fits the show, but it also helps make everything look just a little bit more realistic and less artificial. It even has like a 2.5 second fade in and almost immediately fades back out, so we barely have any time to really pay attention to any of the fine details. Again, helping you not really think about how this is probably artificial. We're gonna lean into that and we're gonna try and recreate that as closely as possible. So that's why I have that as a guide layer in my comp. I'm gonna move it to the top, logo source at the bottom, and I actually don't need to see that logo source because we're going to be using an effect that references that logo instead of actually building on it. So what I wanna do first is go into this textures folder and grab an image that I'll use for the base metal texture of our reflective object. So I'm gonna bring out this metal one. All of these photos are pretty similar, so you can use whichever one you want. You can even bring in your own metal texture if you'd like, but I'm just gonna stick with this first one, and I'm gonna zoom out to show that it is pretty high resolution. So I'll scale it down while holding Shift and make it about the size of my comp, and that way we just get a little bit more of those fine details in the comp. I'm also going to pre-compose this layer, so Control-Shift-C or Command-Shift-C on a Mac, and I'm gonna call this Base Metal. And make sure to move all attributes into the new composition. What that's going to do is crop that pre-comp to the size of this comp, which is important for the effect we're about to apply, which is CC Blobulize. It's a silly name, but if you've never used it before, you can learn all about it in my Effects of After Effects series. Just click the card above if you want to watch that video. I'm not gonna go into every single little detail, but we are gonna be using it pretty extensively for this part. With that effect applied, we need to go into the blobbiness and choose the blob layer, which will define our object's shape. We want to choose that logo source, which actually makes everything disappear because we're currently basing this effect on the lightness value of that blob layer. I don't want to base it on the lightness since it's a black. There is no lightness value to it. Instead, I want to base it on the alpha channel. So I'll choose alpha, and here we go. If you got this kind of goopy version of our logo. If we go to the softness and turn it down, we're gonna define the edges and the contours of that a little bit more. Let me turn my transparency grid off so we can see that clearly. But basically that softness is just going to make it softer and more blobby. We don't wanna push it to this kind of liquid metal look. We wanna back it off so that we're just getting kind of a contoured edge that we can use the lighting effects from this effect to kind of define this metal object. Now there is this other property, cutaway, which is basically a simple choker. It'll bring the edges of the alpha in. I don't want to accidentally cut off anything since there are a lot of little details here. You can see that I'm losing some of that with the cutaway. So I'm just going to turn that all the way down to 0, which is making some of these shapes blob into each other, but we can correct that by using a track matte. So I'm going to come to my track matte column, which if you don't see that should be under this switch right here. And I'll grab the track matte pick whip for that layer and drag it to the logo source. source. So now the alpha channel for this logo source layer is not only defining the effects contours, but also the actual alpha channel of the final result of that layer. And this way we can maintain the original shape of that logo. By the way, my brother Aaron and his friend Dan are both designers, and they happen to have their own YouTube channel where they talk about movies and entertainment. So if you like Cobra Kai, then you probably are like me and enjoy watching movies and TV. So definitely go check out Bonus Locker and leave a comment on one of their videos telling them that Aaron's little brother Jake sent you. All right, so we've already got something that kind of looks like a metal texture, but I wanna adjust the lighting because if we bring up that original title again, it looks like it's being lit from above, right? All of the light is kind of coming from here. It's not coming from the side or anything. Any of the little glints and highlights that we're seeing are on the top edge of each one of these contours. So I wanna recreate that with CC Blobulize. So let's go into the light settings and modify some of this stuff. First of all, the light direction is at -45. That's this kind of diagonal from the top left direction. As I move this around, it's going to shift the highlights. And you can see that if I zoom in a little bit more clearly. So it was at -45, so it's coming from over here. As I shift it around, you can see how that's shifting the highlights. I want this to basically come from directly above, so I'm gonna set it to a light direction of 0 degrees. And now that highlight is coming in on the top edge of each one of these contours. Then I want to go to the light height. Right now, it's basically simulating a light that's kind of close to the camera shining towards the logo. But if I change that light height from 65 down towards 0, it's almost like it's pushing the light forward towards this virtual wall that we're building this metal object on. So again, let me zoom in to show you what that did. If I pull this back out to around 65 where it was, the face of the logo gets brighter and that highlight is closer to the face of the object as well. But if I push it further back, it's going to get dimmer on the surface and it's gonna move that highlight closer to the top of the contour. So I wanna put that all the way to 0. So we're just getting this nice little highlight on the edge of everything. And now I can play with the softness to make that contour bigger or smaller. This is something we can always come back to and adjust. But I think just a nice subtle contoured edge is gonna work just fine. All right, let's close up the blobbiness in the light and go into the shading. And this is where we can control how the light is actually affecting the appearance of this object. So if I turn the ambient all the way down, we're not gonna have any ambient room light now. We're basically just left with what's being produced by that effect light, that virtual light that's giving us these highlights. Because I pushed it all the way to the wall, we don't get any of that surface light. So we can use ambient as a way to kind of bring some of that surface light back in. So I'll keep that in mind as I'm compositing all of these layers together. If I need to bring the brightness of that surface up, I can use the ambient to do it. I could also turn down the brightness of that highlight. It is a little bright, so I could grab the specular and just back it off a little bit. And the diffuse can also affect that as well. So those three properties are the main ones that I'm gonna be dealing with for dialing in the brightness of that surface texture for the metal. But if we take a look at the original title, really the thing that sells this being a shiny metal object is the reflections. All of these dynamic lights, not only those white lights, but also the flames in the object are defining the contours and shape of this object. Right now, we just kind of have a flat metal object that looks very artificial. The reflections are what are gonna bring it to life. So I'm gonna go ahead and change the label color for this base material. Why don't we make it, I don't know, let's say fuchsia. To make those reflections, I'm actually just going to draw a few rectangles that are pure white. So I'm gonna grab my rectangle tool, make sure the fill is set to solid white, and I'll just draw a rectangle in my comp. And I might need to zoom out here so I can see it better. But I don't know what this is going to look like until we actually put it into a reflection. So I'm not gonna worry too much about the placement. I'm just gonna move my anchor point up here so that I can kind of rotate it around because I think that was an angled light that was coming off of the original title. But I'll just place this here and I'm going to pre-compose it. So again, Control-Shift-C to pre-compose. I'll call this reflections and click OK. We'll also make that fuchsia, and I'll move that just above the base material. Now I want to copy this CC Blobulize effect over to the reflections layer so that all of the same contours and properties of the base material are now applied to the reflection. And without even changing anything, you can already see how much more reflective that single beam made this object look. If I grab the offset effect and I apply it just before CC Blobulize, this will allow me to shift the contents of the layer prior to that effect. And you can see just how realistic all of these contours light up as this light is being shifted around this surface of this object. And that's why CC Blobulize is perfect for this project. Now I do need to modify some things. I need to go into the shading. We don't need any of this moody lighting for the actual light reflection. So I'm gonna turn the ambient all the way back up to 100. We'll turn the diffuse down to 0 and the specular down to 0 as well. I want this layer to just serve as that one reflection. If I solo the layer, you can see what it looks like. But if we go into the blobbiness and change the softness, we can really define a little bit more depth to this object and making it seem like it has more of a curved surface on that face of the material. And again, shifting the center using that offset effect really makes this look like a reflective object. Now, this is obviously way too intense and it's pure white, so we have a little bit of a ways to go. But before we do anything, I need to actually make that a track matte of the logo source as well. So let's grab that logo source, track matte, so we don't get all of that extra shininess that's going off the edges of that layer. But because this is still pure white, it's not looking all that realistic. What we can actually do is mix in the original base metal texture to that reflection to make certain areas of the texture appear more reflective than others. And we're going to do that with a set matte effect. And the reason I'm doing it this way is because we just used the track matte to base off of the logo source. So I can't use it to act as a luma matte for that base metal texture. Instead, I'll just use the set matte effect. Since everything is the size of my comp, this is gonna work just fine. So I'm gonna take the matte layer from the base metal. I can actually leave it as the source. I don't need the effects and masks because that would take this version of the logo into account. Instead, I just want that metal texture. And then I just need to make sure that I set this use matte forward property from alpha channel to the lightness. So it's looking at the lightness of the pixels, and even at its default settings, you can now see that texture is shining through. Now I do want to change the blend mode of the reflections to add so that it actually brightens up those pixels. But now that I have that set matte effect, it's going from pure white to this textured version of that reflection. And if I collapse up these layers, I can make that even more dramatic if I bring out a levels effect and I crush the alpha. I'll go to the alpha channel and I'll bring up some of that brightness, or I can bring down some of those darks. As I do this, I can really dial in how reflective that metal texture is. I can even use the output black and output white to brighten everything up or dim it down a little bit. Remember, the original logo is very dim and that reflection is not super white. So I might actually want to do that, bring some of that white down and then play around with the contrast as well. But another thing that you're going to notice about the original reflections is that they are extremely soft. They are not chiseled at all. We can recreate that very simply using a blur. So I'm just gonna search for Gaussian blur. I'll bring that out before CC Blobby lies and just crank up that blurriness. So now my reflection is very soft around the edges and I can really push this super far or pull it back a little bit. We'll dial this in as we go. But now that that's softened, it's going to really make this metal texture look a lot more of a matte material rather than such a clean, reflective material. So going back and forth between all of these effects, we can really dial in the properties of the appearance of that reflection. But let's take a look at that original title again, and you'll notice that there's a lot more texture to their metal. There's rust actually all over it, and the metal source that I'm using doesn't have any rust to it at all. So we can actually generate some pretty convincing rust right here in After Effects. If I go into that base metal comp, let's just build some rust on top of it. So I'm gonna make a new solid, or actually in this case, it's a volume. I'll just make it pure white. A volume is from this script right here, Void. It's another tool from Battle Axe that you can check out again with the card above, but I use this constantly. It just replaces any solid layer type in After Effects with shape layers. And I assigned all my keyboard shortcuts to these buttons so I can create a solid, an adjustment layer, or a null object using Void instead of After Effects native solids. And I think that's just a much cleaner way to work since we're not producing solids in the project anymore. And there are actually a lot more useful features to Void than just that. So go check out Void if you haven't already. Now I'm gonna rename this layer Rust, and I'm going to bring out another effect. We can use turbulent noise or fractal noise. Either one really will work. So why don't we just go with fractal noise? And I'll bring that out onto my layer, which gives us this cloudy texture. And we can basically use this as the start to our rust. I'm gonna change my overflow from allow HDR results to clip because I don't need HDR results, and then play around with the brightness and the contrast to get a texture that might represent rust. So maybe I'll pull that brightness way down and we'll get something that's just nice and tight right about there. And I think that actually looks pretty good. I might go into the transform, into the scale property and scale it down so it's a smaller version of that texture. And I want to blend this on top of the metal texture using the multiply blend mode. But as I do that, it makes all of the white disappear and it keeps the black. I want to use the white part as my texture, so I actually need to add another effect. I'll say invert and just put that right after fractal noise. And now I'm left with just what was white in that original fractal noise blended on top of the metal texture. Now, obviously this is not finished. In fact, I don't want to just use one instance of fractal noise because that looks very fractal noisy. It's very default and is kind of a dead giveaway that I just used fractal noise. But to make this a little bit more unique, all I need to do is duplicate the fractal noise effect, go down to the blending mode and change this to screen. And now it's going to blend two versions of the same fractal noise on top of each other. If I go into the evolution options, I can go to the random seed and give it a different random starting point. And now I have these two textures being blended together before being multiplied onto my background. And I can modify this even further. Let's go to the fractal type and change it to rocky. And now we've got a fractal noise that looks totally different than the default. I could go into the transform even and maybe scale this one up a little bit, play around with the brightness and the contrast. And again, I'm getting something now that looks much more unique than the standard fractal noise. So let me collapse these two up. And obviously rust is not black. I need to color this. So I'm going to use an effect called CC Toner. And this will just give me lots of options for remapping the colors of this texture. Now, I need to leave the highlights white because as soon as I introduce any color, the white that's being multiplied out will not be multiplied out anymore. So I'll leave that as is. But I might change tritone to pentone so I have these four colors to deal with those less than white pixels. And it's already kind of a rust color, but I want to grab the shadows to start with and just make this a very deep, dark red color so it's not pure black. And on the dark tones, I'll make that a little bit more orange, maybe brighten it up a little bit, bring it a little bit closer to yellow, and then we'll grab the mid tones and do kind of the same thing. Saturate it, play around with the brightness values to see how that affects the texture, and then grab this bright section and do the same thing. So maybe this one will be a little bit closer to white. But now I've turned this kind of dark texture into something that kind of resembles rust. And I can always play around with the brightness and the contrast of both of these to dial back how intense that is. But now that we've gotten that applied, let's go back to our original comp and see how it's updated the logo. And right away we can see all of that texture shining through. It looks much dirtier now. It has a lot more grit to it. And if I move the reflection around, you can even see that that's also affecting the reflectiveness because we've set this all up based on that base metal pre-comp. So again, I can come into here and I can back that off if I want it to shine through a little bit more and light it up, but that adds a lot more texture to that base metal that I think fits this a little bit more. And like I said, we can always go into here and modify the brightness and contrast of either of these, change the scale, and completely dial this in to whatever look we need. You could even add in another layer of rust if that's something you think could help. So maybe I want to duplicate this layer and maybe just turn the brightness down a little bit, and that will just darken those darkest areas a little bit more, so it gives it a little bit more depth. I don't think I need that, but I just wanted to point out that it's very easy to dial in the look of that rust however you want using some very simple controls. But now that we have that rust applied, let's take a look at another layer of detail from the original logo, which is these flames. Now originally I was thinking that maybe I could recreate these flames in After Effects. Since it is a blurry reflection, it won't have to be that realistic. But then I realized we're living in the future. I have a phone that can shoot HD at 120 frames per second, and I have a fireplace in my home, so I just went out and shot my own flames. So in the project assets, you can find under the footage, there is this flames footage that you can just apply to any project that you want. It's free, yours to have and keep, but it's going to work perfectly for this reflection. I'm pretty sure the show used 120 frames per second for their flames, so it matches really well. What I want to do is duplicate this reflections comp and rename it flames reflection, and I want to replace this comp with this source footage. And to do that, I can just click and drag this to the comp or down here in the layers and hold down Alt or Option on a Mac. And when I let go of my mouse, it's going to swap the source. So now those flames are keeping all the attributes of the other comp using all of the same effects. Blend modes, track mats, all of that is still there, but we now have flames in the reflection and you can see just how good it looks. Now, I think the blur is a little bit too extreme. The original didn't have so much blur to those flames. You could see the definition a little better. So I'm gonna just just pull that back so it's not quite as blurry. And I think I also want to make it a little bit brighter. So I'll grab these whites and I'll bring that up on the output white. And now that's showing up very nicely in the reflection of that layer. I might even grab this part and bring it up more just to boost it a little bit. And now that's traveling up the logo very, very nicely. It adds a lot of realism and life to the entire thing. Now I might even make that a little bit softer if I go into the CC Blobulize effect, turn that softness up to something more around 10, 12 maybe, and that's gonna wrap around the edges and bounce off the actual contours of this logo a little bit more. I think we're in a really good spot here. If I play this back, you're seeing something that looks very similar to what was in the original. I would just like to add a little bit more lighting to the reflections. And let's take a look at that original title again to see what exactly we can pull from. So as it fades up, you'll notice that there's this one strong light beam coming off on the right side of the logo at this angle, but then there's also kind of a bright spot right here that as we fade up gets brighter, and it looks to me like it's a different angled beam that's also traveling from left to right instead of right to left, and it kind of just moves slowly from this point over to that point. And then there are a couple of other little spots that have some glints on it as well. I think we can recreate this pretty faithfully. What I want to do is make another viewer for this state of the comp, for this actual Cobra Kai comp, by going up to View, New Viewer. Now this is only going to be available if you have the composition active, so make sure you click in the composition, go up to View, and then New Viewer. This will open a second viewer for that comp and lock it so that no matter where I could go into the original title comp, I could go into my reflections, it's always going to be visible here. Now I want to turn that transparency grid off so we kind of have that same view. But now if I move this reflections around, it's going to update every time I let go of my mouse, which is going to make aligning this much easier to do. Now remember, we put an offset effect on that reflections layer. I just want to disable that for now so that I know the positioning is right where it's going to be in the end. But now let's just place this kind of where that first glint was, which is somewhere around here on that original title. In fact, let's open up a new viewer for this one as well. I'll go up to View, New Viewer, and I'll drag this one over to the top of this part of the logo. So I'll probably have to zoom out here. And now we can see both the original Cobra Kai title and my version of that logo that we're recreating. And I can kind of scrub through in time to see that right about here is where we're getting that part of the reflection. So let's jump back to the reflections comp. I'll move this over to the edge a little bit more so we can see that it's kind of lining up right where it should be. And my timeline's not synced up with the original title because this comp is not within this comp. So to fix that, it's really easy. All I need to do is grab that same pre-comp. So actually, let's clean this up. I'll bring base metal, logo, source, and reflections into pre-comps, and I'll grab the original title comp and just move it into this one. It doesn't even need to be visible, but now that it's in this same source, as I scrub around, it's going to reflect in all three of these comps. So I want to be right about here when that original title just starts to fade in, and that's where I want the first position keyframe to be for this light source. So I'm going to rename this Light 1, and I'll set a position keyframe. That's Alt-Shift-P on a PC. I believe it's Command-P on a Mac, might be Option-P. It's been a while. And that'll just scrub forward in time until we see it fade out, and it looks like that beam is gonna end right about here. So I'm gonna move this over to the left side until it gets to about where it needs to be. And obviously I don't want it to stop at that point, and I don't want it to be static before this point. So I need to continue that motion in both directions. And I can use the speed graph to assist me with this. If I go into my graph editor, there's my speed graph. If you're not seeing the speed graph, just click on this menu right here. Let me make this a little bit bigger for you so you can see there's edit speed graph. But with that property selected, it's going to show me those keyframes and how fast it's traveling. That's this linear line. It's moving at this speed at this point in time. And to match that speed in both directions, I can just grab my layer and hold shift until that line is now kind of parallel to the rest of my speed graph. So if I moved it this way, it's moving slower and then faster, but if I just kind of line it up, then it's moving about the same speed prior to that second keyframe as that whole comp will be fading up. And I can do the same thing on the other end of my comp. I'll go to the last frame, I'll move this over while holding shift until that lines up, and now I've basically got consistent speed throughout, and I can get rid of these two keyframes in the middle. Let's go back to our main comp and see how that plays back. So we've got the beam now moving across the entire logo, just sweeping, and that looks pretty good. But let's add in some more of those light sources. So go back to the reflections comp and I'll duplicate this and we'll find that spot where the second light is coming in right about here. Now this one I believe is gonna be rotated more vertically. I'll go ahead and get rid of the keyframes by pressing U and clicking on that stopwatch, but I wanna align this basically right about here. And maybe I'll make this one a little bit thinner. It doesn't seem to be as bright as this one here, but right about there is probably where it's going to start. And then it's gonna move from left to right instead of right to left. So let's set a keyframe right there on the position, move forward as we see that light kind of moving across the original title. And to me, it looks like it's lighting up from the top of the head all the way through the middle of the body here. So I'll just shift this around until it's in about the same spot. And maybe that should be even a little more vertical. Now it's lighting up the head all the way down the middle of the body. And to me, it kind of looks like it stops at that point. Now, I don't think I want it to be completely static. So instead of doing that whole matching the speed thing that I did on the first one, maybe I'll just move it over just a tad bit more to the right at that point, and then controller command click to make that an auto Bezier keyframe so it kind of just smoothly transitions its speed from the first speed into the second speed. And then on the front end, it looks like it's kind of static as well. So why don't we just easy ease out of this position keyframe back to where it's pretty dark. So I'll just easy ease with F9 on the keyboard, and that way it'll come from a resting point into its movement. And you know what? I might even fade it up because at the beginning, the second beam looks much brighter to me. So I'm just gonna add some opacity keyframes, pressing Alt-Shift-T on the keyboard, and then fade it all the way down to 0% so it fades in now. And maybe I'll make that take a little bit more time and easy ease that second keyframe as well. So it fades up as it eases into its movement and comes to its resting point. So let's take a look at how those two together are working. Now we've got these two different light sources moving in opposite directions and sweeping across each other. I think that's looking really good. Let's just fill in some more of the light, duplicating the reflections a couple more times. So let's grab maybe this first one again. I'll bring it to the top. Press U to bring up the keyframes, and let's make this one smaller. Maybe it'll just be on the top half. I'll rotate it around, and I'll actually just click and drag the motion path handles in here to change where this layer is moving. So now that's gonna move left to right. That might be moving a little bit too far, so why don't we grab this handle and move it over? So it's just a little bit more subtle. And if I turn that layer off and on, we can see that it's just lighting up the left side here. So maybe I'll move this actually a little bit further over so that it's really just getting that left edge. And then I'll duplicate that layer one more time, rotate it, resize it a little bit, and then again, move these position motion path handles. That's probably, again, way too fast, so let me grab this one and bring it in. But now we have multiple light sources drifting around each other. Why don't we have them fade in as well so that we're just left with that original light beam for that first reveal? And we'll just copy this opacity keyframes over to these two a little bit further in time so that they're not there initially. Now let's see how all of those are working together in our main comp. This could take a little bit longer to render now that we're stacking a lot of elements on top, but it shouldn't take too much time. And now we can see all of these light sources interacting and moving around, creating a lot of depth layered on top of all of those flames. This is looking really, really cool. So let me close out these other comps and we'll take a look at this a little bit larger so we can really see the detail. But now we have an object that does look pretty reflective, definitely has that metal texture to it with that nice gritty rust texture added on top. And I think we're well on our way to making this entire scene. Now there's one more thing that I'd like to do. If I jump back to the reflections comp, I forgot to put in an actual background, and let me just show you what a difference that makes. By taking a snapshot and then going into the reflections, it'll make a new solid that's pure black and just put that into the background. If I jump back to this comp and show you the snapshot compared to the original, it just makes everything a little bit brighter. The way everything blurs together, I think just looks a little bit nicer, but here's everything together, and we can move on to the next step, which is getting this to look like it's actually in an environment on top of that cement wall background. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe if you're not already, and I'll see you in part 2.